Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back. Thanks to the congregation and Nathan for the invitation. Much appreciated. I had a very wonderful experience last time, and it's great to worship with you in this way this morning. And as I just said, we're back in class and we're also traveling. And my wife and I, we traveled to Germany a couple of months ago on invitation for work. And as long as we were in Germany, we were the guests of the people who invited us there. So, as you can imagine, we reclined at a lot of German tables as the guest of the German. We enjoyed the nice German food and a couple of cold German beers as well. It was heat waves over there, so it was necessary. And for as long as we traveled, we were as guests dependent on our hosts over there. Our time in Germany was thus very, very different to the way we experienced life in South Africa. In Germany, we were the guests. In South Africa, we are usually, almost always, the hosts. Often also the hosts of German people and sometimes of Australians visiting us here in Stellenbosch. And when you're the host, like we are in South Africa, you're pretty much in charge of the situation. But when you travel, we were not in charge as we were the guests. In Luke 14, the long section that we heard this morning, we are in the Gospel of Luke in a larger section called the travel narrative. In other words, Jesus is here, not at home. He and his disciples are en route, they are traveling. And this traveling, it makes them guests and also the guests at certain tables. Luke 14 is a prime example of what's happening in the travel narrative of Luke's gospel, Jesus and the disciples en route to Jerusalem, and specifically about Jesus, the guest. However, Jesus has, and I say this with all due respect, but Jesus has very, very bad table manners. Given the customs of his day, he does not adhere to the table etiquette that was actually required. If Jesus was my son and we were at the same table, I would have made big eyes at him and say, no. That's not how you behave. However, in Luke's gospel, and by means of Jesus's bad table manners, he conveys a very specific message. And now, why do I say Jesus has bad table manners? What is happening here and what is he trying to convey? I will quickly recall what's happening in verses 1 to 24 in this section, in this chapter. You will remember in verse 1, we are on a Sabbath day with Jesus, with a leader Pharisee. In other words, Luke is in the very first verse already telling us, here comes trouble. When Jesus is on the Sabbath day with Pharisees, he makes trouble. That's what he does. And then immediately, Jesus heals somebody from dropsy. Now, dropsy was an illness in which the body retains water. Dropsy also had in those days the symbolic meaning of somebody always longing for more, always almost like the water that's retained by the body. So no matter how much fluid is taken in by the body, the thirst cannot be quenched. You always want a little more power, a little more belongings, especially here, more honor. So with this healing right at the outset of the chapter, Jesus is actually telling the Pharisees, today, I am healing you of your illness of always wanting more. So we're getting from Luke a clue right at the outset of the chapter of what's going to happen here. Now, after the healing, Jesus watches how the guests run to take the places of honor at the table. And right here you have it. They have dropsy for honor. And thereafter, Jesus tells a story in which he says that they must not run for the best places with the most honor. They must humbly take up the other seats where the least will be sitting. And then, after he spoke to the guests, Jesus turns to the host. He tells them that he should not have invited these people who can invite him back. No, the host should rather have invited the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. In other words, He should have invited people who cannot afford to invite him back again, and from whose presence as their guests he will gain absolutely nothing. Now, friends, can you imagine this situation? I'm, as a South African, a guest in Melbourne. I'm at your home for a meal as your guest. Now, firstly, I insult all your guests that you've invited to your home. I call them gluttons for honor. And to top it all up, I then turn to you as the host, and I tell you, you should not have invited all these guests that are sitting around your table who can also invite you back for a meal. No, you should have had a completely different guest list. I don't know if you've ever at a dinner party been in a situation like this. It's when you are at a dinner party and somebody says something very inappropriate. Say, for example, it's this beautiful setting, we're all enjoying a glass of wine and a plate of food, and somebody tells a joke in bad taste. Now, what usually then happens at the table is there's this silence that falls in this situation. Everybody is awkward, shifting around on the seats and thinking, oh my goodness, how embarrassing. Now, what happens next? Yes, next usually is there is somebody at the table who tries to save the day, a person who tries to now shift the attention away, and that we can just think of something else than this embarrassing situation. And this is very similar to what we get in Luke 14, verse 15. Jesus, the guest, just insulted everybody. And now everybody is awkward. And then there's a man who tries to shift the attention away, and he does this by saying, blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. Well, the remark does not work in the way that this person hoped that it would work. No, Jesus takes that remark like a fish takes bait, and he starts to tell a parable about the banquet in the kingdom of God. He tells about a man, meaning God, hosting a feast. God invites people to his table, but they all have excuses. They don't accept the invitation, and God gets very angry and tells the servant to go and fetch the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and later on also people from the alleyways. Now, can you imagine this table, this banquet in the kingdom of God? Can you see who are the people sitting around that table? If we turn again to Jesus with the Pharisee on the Sabbath day on his way to Jerusalem, also this Pharisee hosting Jesus and all the other guests, and we compare that table to the table that Jesus is painting a picture of in the kingdom of God, not one of the people who's sitting there at the table on the Sabbath day are present at the table in the kingdom. Now, I know this sounds like bad news. It sounds like exclusion. And who is this guest preacher from South Africa to actually bring in Australia this bad message today? Friends, I must immediately add the text also tells us there is always etitopos, that is Greek for there is always more place, there is always still room. There is always more room at the table in the kingdom, according to this same text in which God gets angry. I believe the invitation described in this parable about the table in the kingdom of God, this invitation still stands today, also this morning or this evening. It is an invitation that I want to connect to one of my favorite verses from Matthew's Gospel, which reads, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Let's rephrase this in Luke 14 to come to me, all of you who are constantly being hosts and become guests. And I believe it is also a invitation in a very particular time of our history to accept this invitation to God's table to become guests. It is in an invitation to me as a guest preacher in this congregation this morning and all other guests that there might be. It is an invitation, I think, to all Australians and all South Africans who are guests in the world. And it is an invitation to the whole world who are, as inhabitants of the world, guests of God. This is an invitation for all of us who are like Jesus and his disciples in Luke 14, actually in the travel narrative of life. There are so many reasons why some of us are burdened and weary on this journey and why we need rest. I believe the invitation today can also be translated to come to me, join my table, all you hosts who are heavy burdened, and become a guest. I would love to tell you that in this parable, God stands with open eyes and a smiling face inviting us. But that is not what the text tells us. It says that God is very angry, that God stands there with crossed arms and a deep frown, somewhat fed up with the people who did not accept the invitation. Come, God says, come to my table. Don't bring wine, don't bring flowers, don't bring anything but your identity. Bring who you are. What do I mean? I think this is actually an invitation for people specifically like me, like myself, people who are always shying away from this identity of being a guest and is always trying to be the perfect host. I think Luke tells us, bring that identity of trying to be perfect, of trying to be in control, that identity of, let's add, always trying to be strong, to keep it all together. Come. God says earnestly, come to me and my table and be my guest, not my host, but be my guest. Today, I think we are all invited by the graced host to become guests. Why do I say so? It is because a guest has a much more fragile presence than a host. A guest knows she is not in charge. A guest knows he is simultaneously welcome at the home and at home, and a stranger and a sojourner. There is a huge difference between the Pharisee host and his honor-seeking guests. Also, all the people who did not accept the invitation in Luke 14, there's a huge difference between them and the poor, the cripple, the blind, and the lame. The people who did accept the invitation are the fragile people. They already know they are guests on earth. This invitation to become a guest, I think, is also a harsh invitation to me to crucify my identity. It's very challenging. It feels like what I felt like last year when our eldest daughter got her learner's driving license, and I had to teach her in my car to drive. Now, suddenly, I was no longer the host of my own vehicle. I was a guest. At times, as she was driving, sitting behind the steering wheel, I wanted to shout at her, what are you doing? Stop, get out. But I couldn't. I had to remain the guest of my car. Otherwise, she would have never learned how to drive. If I did not shift my identity from being the host of my car to becoming the guest in my own car. Now, friends, I think Luke also tells us in Luke 14 that we are invited to become guests, to be healed of dropsy. I think sometimes it's the dropsy of the rather harsh identity of always being the hosts who are in control. By becoming guests of God, we can begin to imagine what it must be like to be a migrant. Imagine not being at your own table in Ukraine, in Syria, in Somalia, but a stranger at the table. By becoming guests, we start to imagine that earth is hosting us and not the other way around. I think by becoming guests, we begin to imagine being hosts in a new way, in a godly way, which is actually in a crucified way. It is when we accept the invitation to become God's guest that our earthly tables begin to mirror that table in the kingdom of God. When we become guests of the heavenly host, we start to also lay our own tables in this life in the form of the cross. Thank you very much.